The dog hadn't let anyone within 10 feet of her in 3 days. Not the paramedics who'd found them on Route 9 after the accident. Not the nurses who'd tried twice, then a third time, to slip past while Nora Callahan— no, not Nora. Nora was on the list, while the woman in the trauma bay drifted in and out of consciousness. Not even the attending physician, who outranked everyone in the room, and still found himself backing slowly toward the door when the shepherd rose from the floor, hackles up, and made a sound that wasn't quite a bark, and wasn't quite a growl, but landed somewhere in the chest like a warning shot. The dog's name was Ghost. She was a Belgian Malinois, 72 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, with a torn left ear and eyes the color of winter creek water. She wore no vest, no tags except a single matte black disc, engraved with a number and a unit designation that the charge nurse had photographed and sent to 3 different contacts, none of whom had called back yet. Ghost had positioned herself between the hospital bed and the door, and had not moved in 11 hours, except to drink from a paper cup someone had slid across the floor with a broom handle. The woman in the bed was Sergeant First Class Ivy Caldwell, United States Army, 29 years old, formerly attached to a PCOP support unit operating out of Fort Bragg. She had been medically separated 14 months ago. The emergency contact listed in her wallet, a laminated card, military habit, was a post office box in rural Montana. Nobody had come. Outside, the Bitterroot Valley was locked under 8 inches of snow and a wind that drove the temperature to something the Weather Service called dangerous. Inside Mercy Ridge Regional Hospital, the trauma unit smelled like antiseptic and burned coffee, and Dr. Lawrence Finch was standing in the hallway outside room 7, arms folded, staring at the small window in the door. "She needs the IV repositioned," the charge nurse Tamsin told him. "The line is infiltrating. If we don't get in there in the next 2 hours—" "I know what happens," Finch said. He didn't look away from the window. Ghost had turned her head slightly, as if she could hear them through the door. Maybe she could. "What did Animal Control say?" "They said they'd send someone tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning." "There's a storm." Finch pressed his mouth flat. He was 53 years old and had been practicing emergency medicine for 22 of those years, and he had never in his life been outmaneuvered by a dog. He was finding the experience instructive in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Get me Dr. Mabot," he said. Tamsin blinked. "The veterinarian?" "She's on the 2nd floor. Brought in a German Shepherd mix this morning, hit by a car on the highway. I saw her in the elevator." He glanced at Tamsin. "Get her." Dr. Faye Mabot had been awake since 4 in the morning, which was not unusual for her. She was 31, tall, with the particular kind of stillness that came from years of working around animals that could smell adrenaline. She had grown up in eastern Oregon on a cattle ranch, where the nearest vet was 40 minutes away, which meant she had learned to read animals the way other children learn to read books. Not as a skill, but as a survival language. She listened to Finch explain the situation in the hallway. She looked through the window at Ghost. "What's her unit number?" she asked. Tamsin handed her the photograph of the tag. Faye looked at it for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, quiet and careful, like a door opening in a dark house. "How long has Sergeant Caldwell been out?" she asked. "She comes in and out. Lucid for maybe 20 minutes this morning, then the fever spiked again. Septicemia from the laceration on her left thigh. She needs the IV repositioned, and we need to run a second line. And that dog," Finch gestured toward the window, "that dog has decided she's the only one allowed to make that call." Faye handed the photograph back to Tamsin. "Give me 5 minutes with her alone." Finch started to object. Faye was already walking toward the door. She pushed it open slowly, the way she always entered a space where an animal was frightened or in pain. No sudden movements, no direct eye contact. Weight slightly back on her heels, so her posture read as retreating rather than advancing. Ghost came to her feet immediately. Her body was a single line of attention, ears forward, tail still, weight distributed like she was deciding something. Faye stopped just inside the door. She didn't speak. She stood there and let the dog read her. Ghost's nostrils worked steadily. She took 3 slow steps forward, then stopped. Her tail had not moved. Faye crouched down to the dog's level, which was the thing most people got wrong. Staying upright made you a threat, a shape that loomed. She let her hands hang loose between her knees and kept her gaze soft, directed at the floor just in front of Ghost's paws rather than at her face. "Hey, girl," she said very quietly. "Not a command, not a request. Just a sound that meant I see you." Ghost took another step forward. The woman in the bed made a small sound, something between a cough and a word, and Ghost's head swung instantly toward her. That was the thing, Faye realized. The dog wasn't guarding the room. She was guarding Ivy. Every movement, every position she'd taken since the accident had been calculated not to keep people out, but to keep Ivy in sight, to stay between her and anything that moved too fast or reached without warning. This wasn't aggression. This was the specific, exhausting vigilance of an animal that had been trained to protect one person in the worst possible circumstances and was still doing that job long after anyone had told her to. Faye sat all the way down on the cold floor. Ghost watched her for a long moment. Then, with the slow deliberateness of an animal making a decision it might regret, she walked over and put her nose against Faye's knee. Faye didn't move. She let the dog smell her hands, her sleeves, her shoes. She smelled like antiseptic now, like the hospital, but underneath that she smelled like other animals, like hay and cold air and the specific mineral tang of Montana winter, and maybe that was something, or maybe Ghost had just run out of energy to be afraid. After 4 minutes, Ghost sat down, not at the door, beside Faye's knee. Faye stood up slowly, crossed to the bed and called through the door, "You can come in now." It took another 40 minutes to reposition the IV and establish a second line. Ghost watched every movement from her position near the window, tracking the nurse's hands with the flat professional attention of someone reviewing a report. She didn't rise. She didn't make a sound. When Tamsin accidentally dropped a pair of forceps and the clatter rang through the room, Ghost flinched but stayed down, and afterward her eyes moved to Faye as if checking a reference point. Faye stayed in the room the whole time. She didn't know why, exactly, except that Ghost clearly needed her to. When the nurses left, Dr. Finch paused at the door. He looked at Ghost, then at Faye. "Thank you," he said. It sounded like it cost him something. "She's exhausted," Faye said. "She's been running on fear for 3 days. She needs water, food, and about 12 hours of sleep." She paused. "So does Sergeant Caldwell, but I expect that's more your department." Finch almost smiled. "I'll have someone bring food for the dog." After he left, the room went quiet. The monitors beeped their steady rhythms. The snow pressed against the window. Faye pulled the single chair close to Ghost and sat down, and the dog rested her chin on Faye's knee and closed her eyes for the first time in 3 days. Ivy Caldwell came fully conscious at 9:30 that night. She surfaced the way people did when fever broke. Not all at once, but in stages, the mind reassembling itself like a photograph developing in chemical dark. She was aware of the beeping first, then the weight of the blankets, then the particular institutional smell of a place that was not home. Her hand moved before she was fully awake, reaching automatically to the left side of the bed. Her hand found fur. Ghost was there, chin resting on the mattress edge, watching Ivy's face with the still, patient attention she'd maintained for the last 72 hours. Her tail moved once, twice, slowly, like a flag at half-mast rising. "Hey," Ivy said. Her voice came out wrong, dry and cracked and small. "Hey, you, I'm here." Ghost pressed her nose into Ivy's palm. Ivy closed her fingers around the dog's muzzle and held on for a moment. And then she made a sound that was too exhausted to be a sob, just a long, slow exhale that seemed to empty her of something she'd been carrying too long. She looked up at the ceiling. Then she noticed Faye, asleep in the chair with her jacket pulled over her shoulders like a blanket. Ivy watched the stranger for a long moment. Then she looked back at Ghost. The dog's eyes said, "I checked. She's all right. Ivy had learned to trust Ghost's judgment on that long before she'd learned to trust her own. She pressed the call button. A nurse appeared within 2 minutes, then Dr. Finch shortly after, and there was a period of efficient medical activity that Ivy tolerated with the practiced stillness of someone who'd spent a lot of time in situations where the right response was to stay quiet and let other people do their jobs. Her fever was down to 101. The infection was responding to the antibiotics. Her blood pressure had stabilized. "You're going to be fine," Finch told her, "but I want to keep you for at least another 4 days." Ivy nodded once. She was looking at Faye, who had woken up somewhere in the middle of all this and was now sitting forward in the chair, hair pulled loose from whatever it had been in, watching Ivy with an expression that was careful and warm, and a little uncertain. "She yours?" Ivy asked. She meant Ghost. "No," Faye said. "I'm the vet. I was just the one she'd let in." Ivy was quiet for a moment. "Then she doesn't let many people in." I noticed. Another pause. Ghost had moved so that she was touching both of them, her back against the side of Faye's chair, her chin still on Ivy's mattress. "Thank you," Ivy said. It sounded like it cost her something, too. In the morning, when the storm had softened to a grey, muffled snowfall, a woman arrived at the hospital front desk and asked for Sergeant Ivy Caldwell. The woman was 44 years old, grey-eyed, with the bearing of someone who'd learned composure the hard way. Her name was Colonel Denise Farrar, retired, and she had driven 6 hours through the storm from a town nobody outside of Montana had ever heard of. She was the woman who had trained Ghost. Faye happened to be in the lobby when Colonel Farrar arrived, buying the worst coffee available from the machine near the entrance, because she hadn't gone home and wasn't planning to, not until she knew Ivy was stable. She watched Colonel Farrar present identification to the desk nurse, watched the quiet efficiency of the way she moved, and felt the particular shift in air pressure that sometimes accompanied people who carried a lot of weight without ever setting it down. She introduced herself. "Faye Mabott, veterinarian. I'm the one who got your dog to stand down." Colonel Farrar looked at her for a moment. Ghost actually stood down, eventually. Something moved across Farrar's face, surprise, and underneath it something softer. "She hasn't done that for anyone except Ivy in 2 years. How long have they been together?" Faye asked. Farrar was quiet for a moment. "Ghost was Ivy's dog in country," she said finally. "On paper, Ghost belonged to the unit. But you know how that goes." Faye, who did not know how that went but understood the particular bond between a working animal and the one human who was their whole world, nodded. When Ivy got hurt, Farrar continued. "There were complications, paperwork. Ghost should have gone back to the training facility. Ivy had other ideas." The colonel's expression held no censure. By the time anyone official noticed, Ivy had been medically separated, and the two of them were already in Montana. They rode the elevator in silence. What happened in room 7 that morning took only about 20 minutes, but Faye would find herself thinking about it for a long time afterward. Colonel Farrar entered the room, and Ghost came to her feet, every muscle in her body a single focused line of attention. But she didn't step forward. She stayed beside the bed, pressed against Ivy's leg, and watched. Colonel Farrar crossed to the foot of the bed and looked at Ivy. Neither of them spoke for a moment. It was the silence of two people who had shared something that doesn't have ordinary language around it. "You look terrible," Colonel Farrar said. "I've looked worse," Ivy said. "I know, I was there." Ghost sat back down. Whatever she'd been reading in the room, she'd made her assessment. The conversation that followed was mostly practical. The colonel had connections who could help with Ivy's living situation. With resources she'd been too proud or too exhausted to seek out herself, with the bureaucratic tangle that had followed her separation. But at one point, Farrar said something quietly, something Faye wasn't meant to hear from her position near the window, and Ivy turned her face away to the wall, jaw working. Faye heard it anyway. Farrar had said, "He wanted you to have her. He made sure of it before he deployed. He, Faye didn't know who he was. She would learn later, much later, that he was Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, 26 years old, Ghost's original handler, Ivy's partner in the field, and the person who had died in an ambush outside a compound in Kandahar province, while Ivy was being medivaced out with a shattered femur and couldn't have saved him no matter what she'd done, no matter how many times she'd replayed the sequence, looking for the moment she could have changed it. She'd been looking for that moment for 14 months. What Farrar said to her, what she told her that Marcus had arranged before he deployed, had made sure of, had written into his final administrative requests, was the thing that broke through. Not loudly. Ivy didn't cry the way people did in movies. She turned her face to the wall, and her shoulders moved once, and Ghost pressed her entire body against the side of the bed and stayed there. When Ivy turned back, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "He always did handle the paperwork better than me," she said. Farrar laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her. He really did. Ghost put her chin on the mattress. Faye left the hospital that afternoon to go home, shower, and sleep for a few hours. She came back at 7, which she told herself was because she wanted to check on the German Shepherd mix on the 2nd floor. She had left her number with Tamsin in case there were any further issues with Ghost. This was professional responsibility. Ghost was asleep across Ivy's feet when Faye arrived. Ivy was awake, reading something on a phone that looked like it had been through a war, which it probably had. She looked up when Faye knocked on the open door. "The vet," she said. "Dr. Mabbott," Faye offered. "Faye, you can call me Faye Ivy." A pause. "You came back? I have a patient upstairs." Ivy looked at her steadily. Faye did not look away. Ghost opened one eye, assessed the situation, and closed it again. "Sit down," Ivy said. So Faye sat down in the same chair she'd slept in the night before, and they talked. Not about anything important at first. The storm, the coffee situation in this hospital, the particular misery of the cot in the emergency waiting room versus the marginally less miserable chairs in the hallway. But then, gradually, the way conversations sometimes went, when two people were tired enough to have stopped performing, they talked about other things. Ivy talked about Montana, about the cabin she'd found, the 12 acres that had no neighbors close enough to see smoke from her chimney, the way Ghost had learned to track elk and then started doing it voluntarily at dawn as a kind of personal project. Faye talked about the ranch she'd grown up on, about the way her father had taught her to read an animal's body language before she could read a clock, about why she'd come back to Montana after vet school when every sensible financial decision pointed somewhere else. "Montana gets in you," Ivy said. "It really does," Faye agreed. Ghost shifted in her sleep, and her tail moved slowly even though she was dreaming, and they both watched her for a moment in the particular companionable quiet of people who understood that some things were worth watching without saying anything about them. On the 3rd day, Dr. Finch found Faye in the hallway and told her that Ivy's blood work had come back clean, that the infection had cleared, and that barring anything unexpected, Ivy could go home at the end of the week. "She'll need follow-up," he said. "The leg will require physical therapy. And she needs—" He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who had learned the hard way what happened when doctors overstepped. "She's been alone out there for over a year. Whatever happened before she came here, she was running herself into the ground." "I know," Faye said. He looked at her. "You're not a psychiatrist. No. Or a social worker. No." He studied her for a moment longer. "She trusts you," he said. "Or more precisely, Ghost trusts you and Ivy trusts Ghost. So," he made a small gesture that seemed to say, "I'm a doctor. I don't believe in things I can't measure, but here we are." Faye nodded. She went back to the room the morning they discharged Ivy. It was clear and bright outside, the kind of winter morning that felt like an apology after a week of storms. The snow on the mountains caught the early light and threw it back as something that had no business being so beautiful given the temperature. Ivy stood at the hospital entrance with Ghost on a lead, dressed in clothes Colonel Farrar had brought, worn jeans, a thermal layer, a canvas field jacket that had seen better years. She moved carefully, favoring the left leg, but she stood straight. She had the posture of someone who had been trained not to let pain show, and then had gotten too tired to maintain that performance, and was now at the particular grace note of someone who had simply accepted the difference between what their body could do and what they wished it could. Faye was there because she'd offered to drive. Ivy had no car. Her truck was still somewhere on Route 9, possibly totaled. Colonel Farrar had returned to her own obligations. Faye had a truck and free time, and no particular reason not to make the 40-minute drive into the valley. Ghost got into the back seat without being asked, turned 3 times, and lay down. They drove for a while without talking. The radio was off. The heater made a sound like it was thinking about working and occasionally delivered on the promise. "You didn't have to do this," Ivy said. "I know. Another mile." The mountains pressed in on both sides of the highway, snow-topped, enormous, Farrar said. Ivy stopped. Tried again. She said, "You sat on the floor of my hospital room for 4 minutes without saying anything until Ghost decided you were okay. About that long, yeah. Most people don't have the patience for that." "I grew up around horses," Faye said. "You learn pretty fast that patience isn't actually a virtue. It's a technique." Ivy turned to look at her, something shifting in her expression. A small recalibration, the kind that happened when you'd had someone measured a certain way, and then they said something that didn't fit the measurement. "That's true," she said. The cabin appeared through the trees about 20 minutes later, low-slung, log-built, with a porch that wrapped around the front and a woodpile stacked with the careful precision of someone who took winter seriously. Smoke was not coming from the chimney. It was cold inside, Faye realized. Ivy had been gone for almost 2 weeks. She put the truck in park. "I can help you get the fire going," she said, "if you want." Ivy was quiet for a moment. Ghost had sat up in the back seat and was looking at the cabin with the alert readiness of someone arriving home after a long absence. "Yeah," Ivy said. Not like she was doing Faye a favor by accepting. Like she'd decided something. "Okay." They got out into the cold together. The former soldier, the veterinarian, and the dog who had held an entire hospital at bay, and walked up the porch steps and pushed open the door that wasn't locked because nothing for miles in any direction required a lock, and went inside. The cabin smelled like pine smoke and old coffee, and the specific mineral cold smell of a Montana winter that had gotten in while nobody was home. Faye went to the wood stove. Ivy lowered herself carefully to the bench near the door, favoring the left leg, watching Faye work with the same evaluating quiet she'd probably used to assess everything and everyone for the past 14 months. Ghost went to her spot near the window, the one that caught the afternoon light, the one she'd clearly had for a long time, and lay down and put her head on her paws and let out a long, slow breath. The kind of breath that meant, This is where we're supposed to be. Faye got the fire started. It caught on the 3rd try, and within a few minutes there was a sound in the stove like something waking up, and the cold at the edges of the room began its slow, reluctant retreat. She stood and turned around. Ivy was watching her from the bench, with an expression that was hard to read and probably meant something. Ghost was watching too, eyes half closed in the particular drowsy contentment of a dog who had finally, after 11 days of relentless vigilance, decided that the situation was under control. "Thank you," Ivy said. It was the 3rd time she'd said it in a week, and this time it was different from the other 2. Quieter, but carrying more weight. "You're welcome," Faye said. She didn't leave right away. There was coffee to make, and a wood supply to assess, and Ghost needed water, and by the time all of that was sorted out, the afternoon light was doing something extraordinary through the west-facing window, hitting the snow outside and bouncing back in a way that made the inside of the cabin feel briefly warm in every sense of the word. They sat at the small table near the stove, Ivy with her legs stretched out carefully, Faye with both hands wrapped around a mug, and the silence between them was the kind that didn't need filling. Ghost slept. Outside, the mountains held their ancient, patient shapes against the winter sky, indifferent to everything except the snow that fell again toward evening, softly this time, covering the road back down and staying there.